On October 12, 1972, a small chartered aircraft departed from Uruguay, South America. This plane was headed to Santiago, the capital of Chile, carrying members of a rugby team who were tall and broad. In total, there were 45 passengers, including some of the players' family members and friends. The flight was expected to be short, typically taking only 3 hours to travel from Uruguay to Santiago. However, en route, the plane would have to navigate the vast Andes Mountains. The Andes mountain range in South America is the world's longest mountain range, second only to the Himalayas. The highest mountains are found here, and these beautiful peaks became devastating for the passengers in our story. On October 12th, there was a storm in the mountains, which made it impossible for the plane to continue flying. The pilots decided to land midway and attempt the flight again the next day. The plane landed in Mendoza, Argentina for the night. The next day, on October 13th, the plane took off again at 2:18 p.m. The pilots ensured that the weather had cleared up, making it a smooth flight for the next hour. At 3:21 p.m., the pilots began descending the aircraft. The plane was quite close to Santiago, but it was still in the mountains since there are high peaks right next to the city. While descending, suddenly, there was severe turbulence. The plane started shaking horizontally. At this point, clouds enveloped the aircraft. Nothing was visible except the clouds. Suddenly, the alarms in the plane went off, and the warning lights began to flash. No one could understand why. The rugby players in the passenger seats weren't frightened. They didn't take the turbulence seriously. Amid jokes, a passenger glanced out of the window and saw the clouds clearing, but then he noticed that they were dangerously close to a mountain. As soon as the aircraft emerged from the clouds, the pilots realized they were heading toward a massive rock. Instantly, in a panic, they tried to lift the plane. The aircraft's ground collision alarm was ringing loudly. The pilots applied maximum power to gain altitude and fly over the mountains safely, but unfortunately, it was too late. The rear part of the aircraft collided with the mountain while ascending. The entire rear portion of the plane separated, and the 2 rows of seats at the back were ejected from the aircraft. 3 passengers were thrown out with it and disappeared. The plane continued to climb for a few more seconds, but then it suddenly started to fall. Moments later, another collision occurred, causing the left wing of the plane to break off. More passengers were ejected from the plane and fell. Now, only the front portion of the plane remained, which fell straight onto a glacier. It slid down the glacier at a speed of 350 kilometers per hour and, after dropping 700 meters, finally came to a halt in the last collision. Everything in the plane was destroyed. The passenger seats were torn apart from the base of the aircraft, the cockpit was completely crushed, and the pilots were killed instantly. The aircraft lay broken on an unknown mountain in the Andes at a height of 3,570 meters. Surprisingly, out of the 45 people on board, 33 were still alive. They had somehow survived the crash. The problem was that many of them were injured, and no one knew where they were stranded. It was later discovered that the plane was 80 kilometers off its planned route, and this painful story of survival had just begun. Neither those people could have imagined at that time, nor can you imagine now, what happened to these survivors next. This is the heart-wrenching story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. Let's learn about it in today's video.
An old transport plane crashed in the Andes Mountains. 45 persons were aboard, given up for dead.
Survival fascinates people.
All of the passengers were given up for dead.
It became known as the Miracle of the Andes.
Before starting this video, I'd like to recommend spending your time watching informational and educational content. There are thousands of ways to waste time on social media, but by watching videos like this, you gain a better understanding of the world and acquire valuable knowledge. If you want to watch more informative videos like this one, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for notifications. Thanks. Right after the crash, there were 2 survivors who sustained minor injuries: 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino. Since both were medical students, they promptly assessed who was alive and how to assist the injured. They observed that many passengers had suffered severe injuries. Among them was 23-year-old Fernando Parrado, who was in a coma due to a skull fracture. These 2 medical students endeavored to aid the survivors. Meanwhile, within an hour of the plane's disappearance, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service received notification. 4 aircraft were dispatched to search for the survivors. Despite searching diligently from dusk till night, they regrettably found nothing. The rescue service officers concluded, after hearing the radio transmissions, that the aircraft must have crashed in a remote and inaccessible area. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that the aircraft was white in color, and it had crashed in a place where there was white snow and ice all around. It was extremely challenging to locate it amidst the snowy mountains. On the night of October 13th, the remaining passengers remained hopeful. They hoped that if they could somehow endure the night and find a way to escape the cold, someone would find them the next day. Unfortunately, 5 injured passengers couldn't survive that snowy night, reducing the number of survivors from 33 to 28. These survivors utilized the remaining body of the plane as a shelter. They used luggage, seats, and snow to seal the rear of the plane so they could stay warm inside. The next day, on October 14th, 11 different aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay were deployed in the search operation. The search area they chose was correct, and the location of the crash site was within that search area. However, they were still unable to locate the crash site. Survivors attempted to use lipstick to write SOS on the plane's roof. They started writing SOS, but soon realized they didn't have enough lipstick to complete all the letters. Then, they tried to use suitcases to create a large cross in the snow so that search aircraft flying above could spot them. However, they soon realized that this method was ineffective. On that day, they saw not 1, not 2, but 3 aircraft flying over them. They screamed, waved their hands, and did their best to attract the attention of the aircraft, but unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. Another day passed in their desperate attempt. The next day, October 15th, the survivors realized the urgent need for water to stay alive. A passenger named Fado Strauch found a solution. He utilized a metal sheet as a solar collector, focusing the sun's rays to melt the snow, and collected water droplets in empty wine bottles. In addition to this innovation, many passengers used seat cushions as makeshift snowshoes, while the wool from the seat covers was utilized to protect them from the cold. On October 16th, 3 days after the crash, Fernando Parrado woke up from his coma. As soon as he regained consciousness, he discovered that his mother had passed away in the crash, and his 19-year-old sister was severely injured. Parrado tried his best to keep his sister alive, bringing food and water for her. However, as the days went by, 8 days after the crash, his sister succumbed to her injuries. Most of the passengers were from coastal areas and had never seen snow before. Suddenly, they found themselves enduring temperatures as low as minus 30 degrees Celsius at such a high altitude without proper food and water. Despite these harsh conditions, they somehow managed to survive. Another challenge they faced was snow blindness. When the ultraviolet rays of the sun reflect on the snow and ice in the mountains, it can cause damage to the eyes. This condition is known as snow blindness. These survivors had only 3 pairs of sunglasses to protect their eyes. On October 21st, 8 days after the crash, search and rescue teams gave up. They believed that since they could not find any signs of survivors in those 8 days, there was no point in continuing the search operation. There was little chance that anyone could have survived after so many days. So, after 142 hours of search operation, this search effort was officially stopped. Meanwhile, the survivors found a transistor radio among the seats of the aircraft. A survivor and rugby player named Roy Harley was also an electronics enthusiast. He attempted to switch on the radio and improvised a long antenna. Due to his efforts, the radio finally started working. However, this radio could only communicate one way. The survivors could hear things, but could not send any messages. They turned on the radio 11 days after the crash, and then they came to know that the search operation had been canceled. Their hearts were completely broken. Some people started crying after hearing this news, while others clasped their hands and began praying to God.
Feeling that the world is alive and they consider you dead.
Fernando Paradu was the only one who did not react much after hearing this news because he was planning something else. By the 11th day, survivors were running out of food. They didn't have much to begin with. There were only 8 chocolate bars, 1 tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, a jar of almonds, a box of peanuts, some dates, candies, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine. A few days after the crash, they started rationing food, eating very little each day. Paradu ate a chocolate-covered peanut for 3 days, just 1 peanut. However, rationing was not enough because the food was almost gone. There were no trees or plants at an altitude of 3,800 meters, nor were there any animals that could be hunted and eaten. By the 11th day, the food was completely depleted, and some people attempted to eat parts of the plane. They tried consuming the cotton in the seats and the leather on the seats, but this only exacerbated their illness. In such a dire situation, with no alternative other than starving to death, these survivors made a startling decision to stay alive. They concluded that there was no other recourse but to consume the bodies of their deceased friends and family. It was not an easy decision to make, as most of the individuals who had perished in the crash were their friends, classmates, family members, or relatives.
We have to eat, and the only proteins are the dead bodies of the people that were in this plane.
Since Canessa came up with this idea, he was the first to try it. Some others attempted as well, but they couldn't stomach it. They refused. However, 2 days later, with no other option, finally, even they chose to consume human meat. On October 29th, 16 days after the crash, the survivors found their new food source rapidly depleting. They had no plan of action. No one knew what to do next. The situation could not have worsened further. But then, that night, they heard a loud rumble. It turned out to be an avalanche. A large amount of snow was descending so fast from the mountaintop that it filled the broken plain with snow. Eight people were lost in the snow and suffocated. Only 19 survivors remained.
Said, Roberto, you had it. You're going to die. That's it. A very nice sensation of heat between my legs because I was peeing on myself and saying, that's it.
The remaining 19 people were also trapped in a small space under the snow. Paradu used a metal pole to make a hole in the snow to allow some ventilation. After working hard for 2 days, they dug a tunnel under the snow, and with great difficulty, they managed to reach the surface. As soon as they got out, they saw a snowstorm approaching, and it would be prudent to go back into the snow cave to survive. For the next 3 days, the remaining survivors somehow managed to endure the cramped space. 3 days later, they emerged back to the surface, and the weather was clear. After coming out, the survivors realized that no one was coming to save them. If they wanted to stay alive, they would need to put in the effort themselves. There was no point in sitting at the crash site waiting for help. They needed to try their best until their last breath. Canessa, Paradu, and Vizintin were among the strongest survivors. All the survivors decided together to allocate them more food and the warmest clothes because they would try to walk around and search for help. The first task was to estimate the location before the crash. The co-pilot had mentioned that their aircraft had passed through Curacao, so they estimated that if they walked a few kilometers to the west, they would definitely reach some countryside areas of Chile. However, their estimation was extremely wrong. In reality, the co-pilot didn't know where he was taking the plane. Their crash site was actually 89 kilometers east in the middle of the Andes Mountains. Still unaware of this, they rested for a few days to build up their energy. On November 15th, 33 days after the crash, these three people set out to find help. After traveling for hours towards the east, they found the rear part of their aircraft, the part that had broken apart first. Inside it, they found many suitcases, boxes of chocolates, 3 meat patties, a bottle of rum, extra clothes, comic books, and some medicines. Along with these supplies, they found the aircraft's two-way radio system, a radio that can not only facilitate incoming communication, but can also send messages. They decided to spend the night there. The next day of the expedition, they walked a little further to the east. However, after discussing, they believed that they should try to turn on the aircraft's radio. They decided to retrieve some batteries from the main body of the aircraft and then attempt to start the radio. This way, they would be able to send out an SOS call. They found a 24-kilogram battery in the tail section, but it was very heavy, and they could not carry it back to the main crash site. So, they decided to try to turn it on right there. They went back and sought the help of Roy Harley, the one who had some knowledge of electronics. Unfortunately, this plan didn't work. The problem was that the aircraft's electrical system worked on 115 volts AC, and the battery they found was 24 volts DC. They had no means to connect them. They tried their best to start the radio for a few days, but soon realized that there was no other way to survive. They now had to start walking westwards. On December 11th, 59 days after the crash, another avalanche came. 3 more survivors died in it.
I was trapped completely by the snow in the avalanche, and it's the most deadly silence you may imagine. I couldn't move.
Only 16 remained. To climb the mountains in the west, they needed a way to sleep at night. How could they survive the cold nights of minus 30 degrees Celsius? Among the survivors was an 18-year-old boy, Carlos Miguel Rodriguez. He remembered that his mother had taught him how to sew with needles. He was carrying his needles and sewing kit with him. He had an idea to stitch different pieces of clothing to make a big sleeping bag.
I had the idea that with the insulation you could make a sleeping bag. But I not only had the idea, I made it myself.
They did the same thing the very next day, December 12th. 2 months had elapsed since the crash. These 3 courageous men, Paradu, Canessa, and Vizintin, set out without any climbing equipment to scale the glacier.
The only certain thing was to the west was Chile.
The only certain thing was that to the west lay Chile. Going westward meant that they would have to climb the mountain first before descending. They still believed they were only a few kilometers away, so they hoped to find help by walking for 2 to 3 days. Therefore, they packed a 3-day supply of meat.
And you can imagine, without any skill, without any training, you're like a child when you are confronted with a snow slope. You try to go straight up, you might be using your hands and your feet, you're slipping, you're sliding, and for every step that you go up, you slide back a half a step.
To protect himself against the cold, Paradu wore 3 pairs of jeans. He was also wearing 3 sweaters on top of his t-shirt and 4 pairs of socks on his feet, with a plastic shopping bag over the socks. The cold was severe, and they had no technical gear, no map, no compass, and no climbing experience. At this height, the air becomes quite thin, leading to a noticeable lack of oxygen. Despite these challenges, they kept moving forward toward the mountain. The sleeping bag they had stitched together proved useful at night. During the day, they continued to move forward, taking slow steps. The 3 of them slept as close to each other as possible in that one sleeping bag, and as soon as the sun rose, they resumed walking. Gradually, they kept moving forward together. On the 2nd day, the 3rd day, and on the morning of the 4th day. However, they soon realized that their estimation was completely wrong. They could see no end to their journey ahead. Due to the lack of food, Vizintin decided to return to the crash site, leaving only the other 2 to continue forward so that less food would be needed. On December 15th, Vizintin started his descent, which was easier because it was downhill all the way. He used an aircraft seat as a sleigh and reached the crash site within an hour. It had taken them 3 days to climb that mountain, but in just 1 hour, he was back at the crash site. Meanwhile, Paradu and Canessa kept climbing the mountain. After 3 hours, they reached the peak and saw that all around them, there were only mountains as far as they could see. There was nothing but snowy mountains in every direction.
I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think because what we saw was horrible. Instead of green valleys, we saw mountains and snow-covered peaks 360 degrees around us, to the horizon all around us.
With great difficulty, Paradu tried to find something else to see. Then, on the far western horizon, they spotted 2 mountain peaks without snow. They assumed they should travel in that direction and refused to give up. Paradu and Canessa kept hiking for many days until they finally reached a valley where they found a river flowing. Reaching the river was a great relief because traveling downstream made it easier to find a downhill path. They continued walking and walking, and after trekking for 9 days on December 20th, they finally encountered signs of human presence. They saw some cows in the fields. Exhausted by this point, they were unable to walk any further. Right then, on the other side of the river,
And Roberto said, "Look, Nando, a man on a horse."
they saw 3 men on horses, but when Paradu tried to shout, the river's loud noise drowned out his voice, and the men couldn't hear him. By chance, one of them spotted Paradu and Canessa. He looked at them and shouted back that he would return the next day. True to his word, the man returned the next day on horseback, this time bringing paper and a pencil with him. He attached the paper and pencil to a stone with a thread and threw it across the river. Paradu wrote in Spanish on the paper, explaining that they had come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. He mentioned they were from Uruguay and had been walking for 10 days. He described how his injured friends were still at the crash site, urgently needing help. They were without food, weak, and unable to walk any further. He pleaded for rescue and asked where they were. On the other side, the person who received the message was a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan. He read the note and gestured to indicate that he understood. Sergio then threw a piece of bread across the river. For the next 10 hours, he rode westward on horseback to inform the army command. Meanwhile, the farmers brought Paradu and Canessa to Los Maitenes on horseback, where they finally found some rest. It was discovered that through sheer will, they had hiked 61 kilometers on foot over the last 10 days. As soon as their story became known to others, it quickly became international news.
¿Cómo pudieron sobrevivir ustedes? ¿De qué se alimentaban?
Bueno, sobre ese tema... Sí.
No contestar.
This heart-wrenching story was truly unbelievable. Upon learning of their plight, the Chilean Air Force dispatched 3 helicopters immediately to rescue the survivors. Army officers interviewed Paradu and Canessa to gather information about their location. Paradu had brought the pilot's flight chart with him and had marked the places where they had been hiking. With Paradu's assistance, the Army officers took him on a helicopter to pinpoint the crash site. Finally, on December 22, 1972, 70 days after the crash, Army commanders located the remaining survivors with Paradu's help. 2 search and rescue helicopters reached the survivors to save their lives. A total of 16 survivors were rescued, despite their terrible condition of altitude sickness, dehydration, broken bones, and malnutrition. However, all of them eventually recovered. This story serves as a powerful lesson to the world about the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of hope. As they say, where there's a will, there's a way. That's why this disaster is also known as the Miracle of the Andes. Hope you liked the video. If you did, please share it, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon for more videos notifications. Thanks.